Hello and welcome to the Green Biz panel on nature and regeneration in brand and corporate targets. My name's Tim Greiner and I'm excited to welcome you all here today with our panel. This session is being recorded and will be available on demand following the event. Just a few housekeeping items. We have a chat box and I encourage you to share who you are, where you're from, and any special offers or asks or questions you have. Note that we set up a poll, so there's a next to the chat, between the chat and the people tabs, there's a poll there on the right, and please go into that and select one of the options in the poll so we get a sense of kind of where the audience is at on your journey towards regenerative and nature targets. I'd like to introduce our panel today. We have Erin Billman, Executive Director of the Science-Based Targets Network, Heather Tansey, Sustainability Director for Cargill, and Kevin Rabinovitch, Global VP of Sustainability for Mars. Just as a backdrop, I was talking with some folks from they're focused on biodiversity around the issues of monarch butterflies recently, and we were talking about just the collapse of the monarch butterfly here in the US and the fact that monarch butterflies on the eastern side of the Rocky Mountains are in such rapid decline that we've lost roughly 80% of those butterflies over the population's declined by 80% over the last 30 or 40 years. So that's just emblematic of nature being in crisis, and business has impacts on nature, but also is dependent upon nature and its systems. Companies that work to protect and restore nature across the value chains can not only help address these issues, reduce the risks, but they can also achieve greater resilience. So today we're going to hear about some of the exciting and important developments regarding science-based targets for nature from Erin Billman. And we'll hear from two leaders in this space, Heather Tansey from Cargill and Kevin Rabinovitch from Mars. These companies are at the forefront of setting and implementing regenerative and nature-based targets. Pure Strategies, I'll be also talking about a new tool that we'll be launching, a self-assessment tool for science-based targets for nature, and we'll talk about that as well. So with that, I want to hand it over to Heather. Heather, if you want to get us started.
Sure. Although maybe were you going to hand it over to Erin?
Oh, excuse me.
I'm happy to.
Yes, Erin, if I could hand it over to you, please.
Great. And Tim, if you could just scroll forward a page, please.
You bet.
So I'm guessing that many of you have been inundated with various reports and headlines in recent weeks, whether you're thinking about the Dasgupta review or some of the WEF reports for consultation. I'm not going to repeat all the reasons why addressing nature is important, but I do want to highlight one particular one that was a resolution from the EU Parliament in December, which underscored that corporate sustainability strategies should include science-based targets and transition plans that are aligned not only with the Paris Agreement, but also with the Convention on Biological Diversity and international agreements addressing deforestation. I make this point here because I'm surmising that many of you are familiar with climate science-based targets and the Science-Based Targets Initiative. We are expanding that scope to include nature. And we are seeing through indications like the EU Parliament that the time for addressing issues in silo is behind us. And that we need to be talking about impacts on and dependencies on the whole Earth systems when we're looking at sustainability strategies. Forward a slide, please, Tim. Our aim with science-based targets is to provide a pathway for companies and cities to reach net zero and nature positive. So this is building on Science-Based Targets initiative and adding nature. Together, we aim to discover how to integrate solutions that turn isolated issues into new opportunities to halt climate change, to preserve freshwater resources and water scarcity, to support biodiversity and ecosystem services, to preserve and regenerate land systems, and to secure healthy and diverse oceans. Next slide. And as it fades into view here, when I say we, I'm talking about Science-Based Targets Network. We are about 1.5 years into implementation, for those of you not familiar with this, comprised of over 45 NGOs and mission-driven organizations that came together to realize that it was important to issue consensus guidance to companies on what it means for a company to do their part or to do enough to meet global sustainability goals. This past fall, we issued initial corporate guidance on science-based targets for nature. If you're not familiar with it, encourage you to check it out. This is our first step on our path toward issuing validatable methodologies for companies to be able to claim that they've set science-based targets beyond climate by next year. And right now, we have a corporate engagement program for companies that are particularly motivated to work with us on co-creation. Mars, for example, is one of them. And so happy to provide any more detail through the discussion that's helpful, but with that, I'll hand it over to Heather.
Thanks, Erin. Perfect. Thanks, Tim. So I thought I would start broad and then talk a little bit and ladder down into science-based goals and then how we're using those around regeneration and nature. So when I think about where to start in terms of sustainability at Cargill, it's really always with our purpose, because that's really our North Star. And our purpose is to nourish the world in a safe, responsible, and sustainable way. But we know that if we're going to advance our purpose, that we have to address a multitude of sustainability challenges that we're facing. And you can see the wheel here kind of demonstrates the areas that we have prioritized as a company to set goals and commitments around and really advance as critical focus areas for our supply chains. So if you don't mind going to the next slide, Tim. And as a company rooted in agriculture is how we're going to deliver against those various commitments there. When we approach sustainability challenges like climate change, as an example, we endeavor to think holistically about how we can protect the planet and feed the world. And making sure that we're keeping both of those aims in mind is really critical. Our approach always starts with empowering people who are part of our agricultural system. You know, often we see that the people working in our systems already know maybe the right things to do, or they have innovative ideas on how to drive sustainability. But where we can come in and help them be more successful is by removing barriers, uplifting practices, helping them scale practices that protect our ecosystems, regenerate our soils, all with the purpose of nourishing the world. So if you go to the next slide, Tim, let's take a deep dive into climate as an example. So we've established a science-based target around climate change, and it's essentially our two goals together that make that target. So we have our Scope 1 goal, which is our reduction of 10% within our own operations. And there we're really focused on driving energy efficiency and investing in renewables. But really our biggest opportunity for impact lies outside of our four walls. And that's where our Scope 3 goal comes in. And I think it is really kind of our critical focus. There we're driving towards a 30% reduction per pound of product. And in order to achieve that goal, we really have what I like to think of as a two-pronged strategy. The first is promoting regenerative agricultural practices. So we see this really as a winning strategy for Cargill because it's really essentially making agriculture the how. You know, as we work with farmers to implement more regenerative practices, we're helping the farmers be more successful because they're improving soil health, but we're also helping the planet through carbon sequestration. So recently, you know, to focus on that prong of regenerative ag, we set a goal to work with farmers across 10 million acres to implement regenerative agricultural practices here in North America. And to date, we've engaged 750 farmers participating in 12 programs across 300,000 acres. So we're taking our first step, but we've got a long way to go in there. The second sort of strategic focus or prong for us is building specific strategies in supply chains where we have the most impact. And the example I want to highlight today is the work that we're doing in our beef supply chain. So Cargill's beef supply chain sits in North America, and we've launched our Beef Up Sustainability Initiative as really the primary way that we're addressing climate from that supply chain. So our Beef Up Sustainability Program nestles right under our Scope 3 science-based target. It's also a 30% reduction per pound of product. And what I think makes Beef Up really powerful for us is because we as Cargill sit in the middle of that beef supply chain. We really have an opportunity to connect stakeholders from the farmers and ranchers that we work with and source from all the way through to customers that are really passionate and caring about these issues as well. So through Beef Up, we have 4 main ways that we're driving reductions. The first is the most common sense. We're looking at reducing food waste. The second is leaning into new innovations in this space. So this is where my role is really important. You may have noticed in my title, I lead sustainably for our animal nutrition business as well as for our protein business. And so it's really that animal nutrition space that we see a lot of opportunity for innovation, whether it's targeted nutrition that just improves productivities of animals, or if it's things like rumen modifiers that are out on the horizon that can have a very big impact in cattle farming. And then the last 2, though, also connect into that regenerative ag piece. The third is around implementing regenerative ag practices in how we grow feed. So the feed aspect of cattle production is about 14% of the footprint. And as an example, the way we're actually doing this, so narrowing down to what does this look like on the ground. So we've recently launched a partnership this last summer with the Nature Conservancy, McDonald's, and Target in Nebraska. And here we're working with farmers that are covering over 100,000 acres of corn, and we're working with them to implement new regenerative ag practices. So what we mean by that is cover crops, reduced tillage practices, and diversified crop rotation. And through the work that we're doing here, we anticipate that in 2030, we will be sequestering over 150,000 metric tons of carbon. So really the feed space offers us a lot of opportunity. The second regenerative area that we're looking at is this idea of sustainable cattle grazing. So we, at our core, believe cattle can be a force for good when it comes to climate change. You know, cattle can play a really critical role in a North American context of helping to preserve nature and ecosystems. So our cattle tend to graze in the American West, in the Northern Great Plains. And if you think back years ago, what used to also graze there, that was where the bison were grazing. And those ecosystems have evolved with this concept of an apex grazer. And the ecosystem health is really reliant on that grazing. And if you do cattle grazing properly, there are techniques like multi-paddock grazing and other techniques that the ranchers can use that really help to enhance the health of that ecosystem so that you have more biodiversity and more animals that are thriving. And a quick example of what we're doing there is, so we've also entered into a partnership with World Wildlife Fund, McDonald's, and Walmart to scale sustainable cattle ranching and really connect ranchers across 1 million acres in the Northern Great Plains to help preserve that grassland in its native state, improve soil health, and improve producer and climate change resilience. So I'll turn it over to Kevin.
Great, thanks Heather, and thanks Tim for the invitation to be part of the panel. Yeah, my name is Kevin Rabinovitch. I lead what we call the Healthy Planet team here at Mars, but essentially it's our environmental sustainability program all the way up and down our value chain. And I'm going to take you on a brief bit of a history tour of Mars's work and thinking in this space. So, and actually there's a point on the timeline before this starts, which is in 2007, the IPCC published their 4th assessment report. And shortly after that, we started thinking about setting a GHG target for Mars. And myself as an engineer and my colleague also from R&D who were leading the program or starting the program at the time naturally gravitated towards using science to think about setting our targets. And so that's why in 2010 we set a net zero target for our direct operations, scope 1 and 2 greenhouse gas emissions, and we're already contemplating deep absolute reductions in our full value chain. Then in 2012, a year after the Planetary Boundaries Framework, which was published, which is the sort of colorful spider diagram there, we added those outer rings around it of greenhouse gas, water, and land, and had some thoughts on how those represented a manageable set of targets for a corporation that really addressed a lot of what mattered in the planetary boundary model. And then in 2015, we worked with WRI and a number of other organizations, both academic and NGO and other partners in the private sector, to translate the concepts in that diagram to the left into some very specific tangible targets for water and land. And at that point, the Science Based Targets Initiative focused on climate had formalized the GHG version of that, and we were pleased to be part of helping make that happen. In 2017, we took the work that we'd done with WRI on particularly water and land and used it to launch our targets on reducing or eliminating rather unsustainable water use and holding the land footprint of Mars's full value chain flat over time. And then, as an example of, I think, an interesting area to talk about, which is we spend an immense amount of time talking about targets and very little time talking about results and performance. So I've thrown an example here of what thinking about these targets looks like when we go to actually implement it into a program. And that's our Palm Positive plan, where we've done a radical consolidation of our supply chain down from 1,500 mills to less than 100 mills. And the motivation behind that was knowing what we cared about from the diagram on the left and all the targets and the journey along the way. We realized we couldn't effectively manage a supply chain that was that complicated. So we designed a simpler supply chain where we could put more time into each of the sort of points of origin on the ground and be more involved and more selective about where we were sourcing from. So we were, as Erin mentioned, we're part of the corporate group that's consulting on SBTN. We were also part of the very first kickoff meeting of that group. So happy to take questions from you, Tim, and from the rest of the group, and looking forward to the discussion.
Great, thanks, Kevin. I'd like to just talk a little bit about this, what I mentioned earlier, which is the self-assessment tool for science-based targets for nature that True Strategies has put together and will be launching sometime in the next day or two. This tool it's a free tool, open to anyone. It will take just a few minutes for you to fill out. It's a total of 10 questions. And the intent of the tool is for you to really assess where you are on the journey and your preparedness to set a science-based target in areas such as oceans, biodiversity, fresh water, and land. So the tool aligns with the guidance provided by the Science-Based Targets Network that Erin talked about, and it's best used along with those resources that the network has put together, and there's links in the tool to those specific resources. And I won't go through the self-assessment tool right now, but suffice to say that as you progress through it, there's different options for different questions, and what at the end what you get is some kind of indicator of where your greatest improvement opportunities are, where your gaps lie, for you to make progress in this journey. So, this is an example of what results might look like based upon someone filling out going through the assessment tool. We'll be updating this as the Science-Based Targets Network finalizes their guidance. Right now, the final guidance for setting targets is not yet available. It'll be available in 2022. And I just want to say quickly, you can, if you want to just put a reminder for yourself to check in when this is up and ready for you to take a look at. You can subscribe to our newsletter if you'd like, and we'll be notifying you through the newsletter. So today we've heard from Erin about the network, from Heather about Cargill's program, both the broad targets and then the BFO program specifically. Kevin's taken us through that journey on how Mars really thought about planetary boundaries and set up its targets. And then he briefly told us a little bit about the work in Palm. What I'd like to do is just ask a few questions of the panel and then turn it over to the audience to give you all a chance to ask a few questions yourselves. So the first question I had was, this is for Kevin and Heather, and it's around regenerative agriculture. Heather, I saw that you have regenerative agricultural targets. Kevin, I'm assuming that perhaps you're defining regenerative agriculture as well for Mars. So could you talk a little bit about how you're defining regenerative agriculture? Heather, why don't, if you could.
I was going to say, do you want me to, I'm happy to go first. It's a great question. You know, there are a number of definitions being posed and a lot of people talking about this concept of regenerative ag. So I would say we are both engaging in that dialogue so that we can align around a generally accepted definition for how to think about regenerative ag. But at the same time, we feel like we need to start making action today and start taking steps on that. You know, we believe we can't wait for consensus, not definitions, to start making progress on climate. So we're doing those things in parallel. And finally, when we've set the goal, it's really our belief that the heart of a regenerative system is soil health. And so we're taking a very outcomes-based approach to encourage practices that increase soil health. So when you take a look at our goal around the 10 million acres of regenerative ag, really how we're defining that with the farmers that we're working with on those acres is it's practices that enhance soil health, including no-till, cover crops, diversified crop rotations, and then integration of livestock. So that's kind of where we're focusing our programs and efforts.
Great, thanks, Heather. Yeah, and are you doing performance measures? Will there be like soil testing, for example, to back up?
Absolutely, because that goal, it really is in service of our climate goal. So we could have, we need to also understand what's happening with the soil, what's happening with the carbon sequestration. So we're absolutely monitoring and testing, and we're building the base of knowledge so that we can understand which practices and which regions and areas are really going to give us the biggest bang for our buck, both from a soil health as well as from a climate perspective.
Great. Kevin?
Yeah, so how are we defining regenerative agriculture? Carefully. So I think, again, I feel like I'm telling history stories all day here, but, 3 or 4 years ago, having a sustainable agriculture code or a sustainable agriculture plan was sort of the rage in corporate circles. And I think one of the challenges with that is when you hear sustainable agriculture, it sort of conjures to mind agriculture at some sort of an end state where you want it to be. When in practice, what most people meant was whatever sort of, marginal efficiency or eco-efficiency or slight reductions in carbon or whatever was part of their program. I worry that there's a little bit of the same thing going on with regenerative ag now, that we're very excited by the term, which sort of conjures a vision of, if sustainable ag was sort of neutral and not making things any worse, that regenerative ag is actually making things better. And I think that's sort of the aspiration it conjures. And, I think that's a wonderful vision, but in practice is not what, when you sort of go to the bullet points under the headline, that's not what you see, right? You see a lot of good things that we should absolutely be doing, but not things that are making agriculture carbon neutral 3 years from now or carbon negative even. And so I think, our thinking on this is, but as Heather said, that lack of a definition or confusion around the definition can't become an obstacle to progress. So I think our framing on this is that our language that you'll see more and more from us is about moving toward regenerative. So being more clear that it is a sort of end state, vision. And so the name of our overall program is Sustainable in a Generation, right? Which is a very deliberate acknowledgement both to being a family-owned business that manages itself in generations, but also in the fact that getting where we want to get to is going to take a generation. It's not a 5-year thing. And so I think we would think about regenerative the same way at a macro level. At a micro level, I would largely agree with what Heather said, which is I think in agriculture, it's a lot about not just looking to minimize inputs, which of course we should be doing, but really getting into sort of the mechanics of how the system works. And in a lot of cases, that means getting into soil health and sort of recognizing soil, not just as the physical substrate that stops the plant from falling down, but as a living, breathing ecosystem that actually drives agriculture.
Yeah, I appreciate the subtlety of that, your description there of this as a journey, but still, and, reinforcing the need to paint that journey and also look at the underlying science, the biology, et cetera, to measure kind of progress.
And I think there's a terrible risk that people hear regenerative ag and think, it'll all be fixed in 4 years. And then when we've done some amazing work to improve soil health and make things 50% better over the next 4 years, people go, it's only 50% better. And so there's a little bit of getting the expectations aligned with the incredible things that we can do, but not overselling what we're going to do.
Yeah, we're notoriously impatient, and soil health, changes in soil health, changes in carbon, for example, take a long time. Yeah. So if we have a challenge in regenerative, what about science-based targets for nature? Erin, I was just I don't know, did you want to comment on the regenerative ag piece, or should we turn to that next challenge of setting targets for a new area?
Well, I would just say I can do both in one, I think, Tim. So Heather and Kevin's points underscore why, if you read our initial corporate guidance, we focus on the mitigation hierarchy. And regenerative is a great vision, but the most important thing is avoiding. And then it's reducing where you can't avoid. And then starting to think about restoration and regeneration, and ultimately systems transformation. And so science-based targets are meant to be scientifically possible. So our guidance focuses on what is scientifically possible, and then how can we optimize for the best guidance. And that's challenging. It's challenging for leading companies and wherever companies are on the spectrum to deal with, because there's a lot of complexity, like Kevin's example on realizing the complexity of the supply chain. I worked with Walmart on a traceability project for a green apple dish soap that literally you go a couple nodes back in the supply chain and you're talking about hundreds of sourcing locations around the world. And so the complexity of value chains is an issue. And companies, what we're hearing from companies is, tell me what to measure and how much is our fair share. Now you can imagine associated with that, there's questions of, well, where does a company's responsibility begin and end? If you're talking about back up in the value chain or downstream, how do you allocate? Because when you're talking about nature, you're talking about a place. How do you allocate between the actors that rely on that place? There are some really thorny issues that need to be addressed in getting to the point of having science-based targets. But to Heather's point, that's not a reason to wait, because nature cannot wait, and there is we need thousands of companies, not just the leading ones, to be prepared to set and implement science-based targets fast. And there's things that they can be doing now, regardless of whether they're in the beginning stage of their journey, per your tool that you showed on the screen, Tim, or whether they're somewhere in the middle or they're leading. And first and foremost, understanding the foundational step of value chain impacts and dependencies on nature is the place to get started, and we have guidance on that front. The last thing I would say is that we recognize that companies want to set targets now. We are building the plane, so to speak, as we fly. A lot of the questions are still in the process of being answered in order to put the science in SDGs. And that's why we have the co-design process through our corporate engagement program that we mentioned before.
Great, thanks, Erin. I appreciate that framework that you talked about. And just the challenges that companies have in really thinking through that entire supply chain and thinking about what portion is theirs, how do they measure it, and that kind of makes me think quite a bit about collaboration and how companies can collaborate together in this process, because they might not be the only company working in a particular geographic location. I'd like to encourage anyone who's attending, if you could if you have questions, please list those questions in the chat so we can pick them up. I've got one more question for the panel, and then we'll turn to the chat to answer those questions. So much of this work is about your value chain. Heather, it's what you described about 750 farmers. Yes, partnerships with a variety of different companies, but ultimately it goes back in the case of the Beef Up program to going back to ranchers, farmers, et cetera. And Kevin, the same thing, the example you gave around palm goes back to plantations and smallholders in palm, and I know your work in cocoa and other commodities, it's similar. So I guess thinking this through a little bit, how do these targets, which are based in science, but really require you to go further back in the supply chain, how do they change the way companies do procurement and sourcing? And I'd like to hear maybe a little bit from each of you around what you're seeing, either from your own companies or from the experiences you've had. Heather, do you want to start?
Sure. Yeah, it's interesting. I'd like to believe that it does change how companies do procurement. It certainly does from our perspective when we're looking at our supply chains. And one of the aspects, I think, and you kind of hinted at this a little bit, Tim, but one of the things that we don't always talk about related to science-based goals and particularly Scope 3 goals is that they just create such strong incentives to collaborate as a value chain. Our customers, which include Kevin's and Mars, include restaurants, major food retailers. They've set similar goals, and they want to reduce emissions in their supply chain. And we as Cargill, we don't just share a supply chain, we're actually part of those supply chains. So it just becomes natural for us to use our position to help connect our customers upstream with our farmer customers downstream. And when I talked a little bit about the programs that we've launched under Beef Up, and these are just the beginning programs, we'll have many more that will roll out that we're in the process of developing. Almost all of them, I'm trying to think, I don't think there's a single one that doesn't involve 2 or 3 different stakeholders in that value chain working together, because it's really about our power to link.
Which is the role that Cargill plays in that value chain. Kevin?
Yeah, so I think procurement strategy is everything when it comes to working on these sustainability issues, right? So for anyone that wants to do a little follow-up reading, if you Google the phrase "end of the commodity era," you will come up with a bunch of stuff that we as Mars have written and published. A good chunk of it under the name of Barry Parkin, who's my boss and our chief sustainability officer and chief procurement officer for Mars. And the argument that we would make is most of what you care about from a sustainability point of view, be it deforestation or building carbon in the soil or even social things like human rights and forced labor, is not a product attribute, right? You can't stick an instrument in a bucket of palm oil and measure whether there was deforestation or forced labor in its supply chain. So they're not product attributes, they're process attributes. And to know what's going on with the process attribute, you have to know something about the supply chain, right? You have information and visibility going back up the supply chain. And frankly, that's not the way commodity markets are designed and set up, right? Commodity markets are basically about the things you can measure in the bucket that you're buying, right? You know, the palm oil's got the right fat content, the moisture's low enough, the profile's right, you know, it's not an off odor, so on and so forth. But as soon as you start caring about all those other things, you're not buying a commodity anymore, because you want to know that the palm oil is coming from that farm that didn't have deforestation and that had good labor practices. That bucket of palm oil is no longer interchangeable with every other bucket of palm oil out there. And I think that drives, I don't think we know, that drives a different procurement strategy and a different model to accomplish that goal while still remaining financially viable and competitive. And so I think that's a really profound shift that's beginning to play out. And I think some of the really radical changes that we're trying to drive are going to take that. I mean, it's not agriculture, but another one would be, if you look at the corporates that are able to make the fastest progress on renewable energy in their factories, it's not because they're still going out and bidding out their electricity purchases annually in an RFP. You know, it's because they're going out and working with a developer on a project and doing a 20-year PPA that's direct sourcing. And that's as much about a change in procurement strategy as it is a change in your electricity sourcing.
Thanks, Kevin. Fascinating. Erin.
I was reading all the questions coming through in the chat and wondering if I should be trying to answer some of them.
Yeah. You have one? Was there one that jumped out for you that you wanted to answer?
Well, I saw an interesting one, which is what types of companies and sectors does the broad nature commitment work best? How could this commitment extend to professional services companies with no tangible products? I think for a broad nature commitment, if you look at the IPBES drivers of nature loss, you know, and you're talking about the food and ag sectors, you're talking about the built environment, which touches mining and extractives, apparel. Those are some examples of the types of sectors where a broad nature commitment would make sense. I come from Bain in my professional background, and so I'm particularly passionate about how could commitments extend to professional services companies. We have BCG as part of our corporate engagement program. It's clear to me that identifying pathways for systems transformation for sectors or places is squarely in the wheelhouse of strategy consultants. And if they're taking a responsibility lens to their work, they're starting to, like Kevin's point about the end of the era of commodity, they're starting to think about how can you create business opportunity associated with using the right lens and the right filter, rather than just, for instance, lowest cost country outsourcing. I think that era is behind us. So that's where you know, the product offering of a strategy consultancy could really be relevant.
It's great. Picking up on that, the idea of some of the questions in the chat, I was looking at another question we had here about the importance of simplifying the supply chain. Alicia asks, however, that sounds like moving to bigger suppliers and therefore incentivizing ending relationships with small and medium-sized farms who depend on your business. How do you balance that, that smallholder versus, I guess she's thinking there's a trade-off between that and moving to bigger suppliers that can meet your requirements.
Yeah, so you and I think alike, Tim. I was actually in the middle of typing a response to Alicia, so I deleted that and I'll give it verbally. Yeah, so I think there's two things here, right? So almost every palm mill has a plantation or a couple of plantations feeding it, which are generally larger agribusinesses, and then sort of around that a population of smallholders. So you know, narrowing our supply chain like that does not sort of automatically exclude smallholders. And in fact, one of the biggest opportunities in palm oil is to improve the productivity of smallholders, which then helps contain the amount of land area that's required to grow our crops, which is also our land target. I actually read her question as being about, how do we not sort of at the farmer level, small and large, but more sort of the intermediary business. And that's where, again, I think, what we're looking for are the partners who are willing to transform their entire business, not just the supply chain that feeds us, but the supply chain that feeds everyone that they do business with. And in many cases, that actually puts some of the smaller and medium suppliers at an advantage. Because, if your customer is asking you to change not just what you do for them, but what you do for everyone, if you're a smaller business, it's easier to make that change and you're more nimble, or you can be potentially more nimble. And so I think it doesn't automatically disadvantage, and in certain cases may actually be to the benefit of those organizations. But again, I think the key is, we're not looking to incentivize or reward big businesses versus small versus medium. We're looking to incentivize and reward the performance that matters on the ground, and whoever can move there the fastest, and come with us on that journey is who we want to do business with.
I can even comment a little on that, Tim, just from a different place in the value chain. So and I'll take our beef example. So Cargill, when we are driving progress towards our Scope 3 goals, we're taking a supply shed approach. And so in many cases, we know we source beef cattle from all over North America, so for all over the US and Canada. And we're working with farmers and ranchers in areas where we're sourcing from with the idea that we're going to really elevate the entire system. What's one of the things that was really surprising to me when I took over this role a few years ago is that 80% of the ranchers in the US and Canada have 40 head of cattle or less. So there's a lot of small players. There's for sure some really big ones too, but there's a lot of small players in the market. And so our focus is really to work with those smaller players as well as the larger ones to implement these practices.
Thanks, Heather. So let's turn to a question from Elena, who talked about working with leadership to set targets when there's lots of uncertainty. Her question goes to, how do you set targets without having all the answers around defining regenerative, measuring and tracking impacts, et cetera? And so I imagine each of you have kind of encountered this, or in some way there's uncertainty in setting targets that are 10 years out, right? But businesses do this all the time on, well, maybe not so far out in terms of sales goals, et cetera. But could you quickly walk us through how you've met that challenge and some of the ways you see of overcoming it? We've got 3 minutes here, so we're going to ask you each to be pretty quick.
I'll go first. So I think sustainability professionals are often held to too high of a bar when it comes to long-term targets. The reality is, somebody in corporate strategy has an idea that, we think this business is going to grow consistently at a 4% CAGR for the next 20 years. And someone's got a chart of what the sales are going to be in 2040, right? And it's just times 1.04, right? If you ask them how they're going to deliver the 4% of growth between 2039 and 2040, they have absolutely no idea, right? It'll be some vague hand-waving stuff. The sustainability person comes in and proposes a net zero target for 2040, and by God, you're going to get asked how you're delivering that last 4% of eliminating your carbon footprint. So I think that's one thought. I think the answer to this is we should have long-term quantitative targets that we're chasing, and we should have near-in, sort of 5-year horizon targets. That's where you should be having the really awkward, painful discussions about, do you have a plan for how to do it? Is that 5-year target? And as long as you can always see 3 years, 4 years into the future of what you're going to do, you're fine. And frankly, you're doing as well as any of the financial folks are in your business are doing too.
Thanks, Kevin. Erin, please.
We have guidance on interim targets that are directionally correct that companies can set today. So there's really no reason to wait. And we actually encourage companies that are in a position to take a leadership role to go ahead and do that so that it can help inform what works for us.
Great.
I would just build on what Kevin and Erin said. I think there has to be a little bit of uncomfortableness if you're making a bold goal, but you also, we're really leaning into working with scientists, working with advisors like Peer Strategies that have really helped us think through what are the best tactics and interventions that we're going to take in our supply chain, and really helping to map that out. Because while our goal is 10 years, it takes a long time for carbon to sequester. And so we really have to start thinking and being planful today if we're going to deliver on that goal back in 10 years from now.
Thanks, Heather. I think we're about out of time here. I want to thank each of you for your thoughts and comments today. I thought it was really, really inspiring. I'm taking away from this that, you know, we should take action. We should move quickly. There's no need to wait, and that we should look to some of the leaders out there that are setting targets and advancing and making progress to inspire our own businesses and those companies that we work with to shoot for larger and broader targets in the future. So thanks all. I hope you enjoyed it. There is a survey monkey that you can fill out an evaluation of the panel. Thank you. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.